Hello, good evening, and welcome back. So, UK isolation period shortened to 10 days, and this might have something to do with the fact that, of course, MPs will not get expected pay rise amid economic woe for those 650 MPs there on over 80 grand a year at the moment, before tax, but it is always peculiar that, of course, the public sector pay tax in the first place. If they're being paid because of other people's taxes, then surely it makes more sense for that to just be adjusted for in the first place and not pay tax at all. Surely. But no, I guess not for some reason. It's got to pass through more levels of bureaucracy so that they can take their own cut and then provide a need for their own jobs to exist when they don't. So, first one first. UK isolation period shortened to 10 days. And you might remember from not so long ago, yesterday, that if you've tested negative, then you have to isolate for 5 days. Yeah, even though if you're still negative. So this is, of course, for people who test positive, or if you have been in contact with somebody who has been tested positive through the track and trace farce that is supposed to be there almost immediately, but of course can take a few hours, or days, or a week, in order to then finally get in touch with you, at which point surely it's a bit too late. That if you were exposed that long ago, if it has already gone over your quarantine time, then you were just a missed case and you're no longer a threat, because apparently only 2% of cases are still a threat after 10 days of having had the coof, as in a threat in terms of spreading it to other people, that you're still infectious, if you will, with the coof, in which case 10 days is now the cut-off point instead. And of course we're told time and time again that none of this is political. No, definitely not. It's just following the science. Although it's following the scientists instead, that you have to pledge your allegiance not to God, but to the scientists instead. Not any scientists, but these scientists. Don't you be listening to those scientists, because then you're worshipping false scientists and those idols. But this is definitely not a religion. This is science, which is, of course, the breeding ground for skepticism, but no skepticism allowed in this church of science. I mean, this laboratory of science, because it's science. So, the change will also apply to people instructed to quarantine after returning from high-risk countries. Basically, if you're not in one of those travel corridors, unless you're one of those high-flying business executives, in which case you'll be exempt from it altogether, because that's such a minuscule amount that doesn't really matter, apparently. I mean, let's ignore the fact, of course, that then you would be taking out the most prosperous members of society if it is such a big risk, and they're going to be communicating and interacting with a lot of other people, in which case they're going to be the super spreaders themselves. Let's ignore those inconvenient truths, because they don't fit the narrative, and that isn't very beneficial for MPs and lobbying, because what's the point in getting a lot paid outside of your regular salary if then you're not going to be able to return those favours from the lobbying? That you're not going to be able to be bribed if you haven't got the powers in order to give your friends those kickbacks. So, politicians need to be able to give special privileges to certain people, otherwise they're going to have to exist on their measly 80 grand a year wage, and clearly that's not enough for anybody. And if you're saying that they're not allowed to be bribed either, then how on earth are they going to make ends meet? And please correct me if I'm wrong, but that is the argument, as far as I understand it. That really is it, in simple terms. So, of course, well then, yeah, how about we decrease the amount that MPs can do, therefore we decrease their workload, which means they're doing less, in which case they're not providing as much value. I mean, actually they'll be adding more value by just not interfering, but nonetheless, they're going to be meddling less, in which case they're going to get paid less because they're doing less, which is good for the rest of us, but then they're going to be paid less. And because they can't interfere as much, of course, they're not going to be such targets for bribery, or, lobbying, that's the correct term, in which case then it's going to be the same law applied to everybody. Why don't we do that? Oh, right, because the MPs are responsible for creating those laws in the first place, and they're not going to be the turkeys voting for Christmas. I suppose Nigel Farage was a unicorn in that regard when it came to Brexit. But they say The announcement comes as data shows COVID cases falling in most of England and Northern Ireland, but the ONS figures showed that in the week to 5th of December, there were increases in coronavirus case numbers in London and the east of England. Yes, London. Because, of course, now that it's getting so bad in their Tier 2 lockdown, they've got advisory testing for school students. In Manchester and, the North or the Midlands, where we're decreasing and the cases aren't nearly as bad as London, we've got Tier 3 lockdown rules. Because why? Where's the science here? And I think these things really need to be pushed further. That obviously there is hypocrisy at almost every turn when it comes to bureaucracy and government involvement, but they've really got to be hoisted upon their own petards more often and more frequently and more harshly, and it has to be pointed out so that everybody is aware of it, so that they don't just think, this is normal and it's no big deal, but no, this is normal and it's a huge deal, and just removes any legitimacy that the government might have had many centuries ago before they decided to get into this level of meddling. And of course, it's this kind of thing, the meddling. In fact, it was taxes on rum and tariffs and restrictions on who and where you can buy rum from in the US that led to the 1776 revolution, as well as, of course, the Boston Tea Party. Which, in retrospect, they were just trying to make sure that, all of the oceans, all of the seas, all the way around the world, had a little bit of tea for all us Englishmen. How considerate. So meanwhile, new data shows the virus's reproduction, or R number, is back at level seen 2 weeks ago, 0.9 to 1, meaning the epidemic is not growing, but it's not really shrinking either. Brilliant. Well, the idea is to flatten the curve, not to get rid of it, but to flatten it in for it to level off, which means that, of course, we're going to have new cases, but the NHS will not be overwhelmed. Is the NHS overwhelmed at the moment through COVID? No, it isn't. Is overwhelmed through other things, because of incredibly poor management? Well, of course. But if the idea, judging by what they said, is just to flatten the curve, then it's done. It can stay at 0.9 to 1. That's bloody brilliant. That's fantastic. That's fine. We'll leave it at that then. We seem to have all balanced out and now we're okay. But it's not okay, of course, because it's only fine when it's down to 0, even though they're saying that 0 is not possible. In which case, there is absolutely no intention to get us back to a normal way of doing things whatsoever. Right. So on Thursday, Matt Hancock, Halfcock, announced mass testing would be rolled out for secondary school children, their families and teachers in the worst affected areas of London, Kent and Essex where cases are rising. Exactly, yes. Yes. So, of course, then if you have it 10 days, and if you've been travelling, then 10 days unless you're the travel corridor, or you've got a lot of money. But come on, did we really expect laws to be applied equally to everybody who earn different amounts of money? No, of course not. Whereas the NHS App in England will not update its 14-day count on next Thursday. Why? Because they're just too slow to do anything, essentially. They're very slow and just trying to play catch-up the whole time, and they're never ahead of the curve. So instead of saying, trust us and the experts in the NHS will tell you exactly what to do, they're saying, nah, actually, because there's a lag, anyone who's been advised to isolate by the app can leave isolation if their countdown timer hits 3 days between Monday and Thursday. So, we're going to speak to you as regular people and understanding adults, because you can manage that. But if you can manage that, we don't need to make these draconian laws. Hang on a minute. There's so much shit to point out. So much. So they say people are most infectious around the time they first develop symptoms, and 10 days into an infection, only about 2% will still be capable of passing the virus to others. The change in the rules reflects this low risk, which was judged not to justify asking people to self-isolate for longer periods. So 2% is okay then. So if it's less than 2%, no need to self-isolate. Does that come down to death rates as well? Because that's less than 2%? No. Then how is it justified? Fuck off. Good news though, MPs will not get expected pay rise amid economic woe. The one problem with this is that, of course, the less that they earn, the more they're going to be taken towards bribery. And that is one of the things that you can't really argue with about Donald Trump being a billionaire, or multi-billionaire anyway, is that trying to say you're going to get a few $1 million from this deal or that deal isn't really going to sway him like it has done, objectively, with Joe Biden and his son and China. So at least then, I'm not saying Donald Trump is immune to corruption, don't get me wrong, but as far as money comes into play for bribery, it's not going to work on him. Unless you're then willing to pay hundreds of millions, if not billions, but then it becomes incredibly obvious, can't really be hidden, and is going to be far too expensive to get what you want. In that case, you may as well just play by the rules because it's going to be cheaper. The only reason they bribe is because it's cheaper than playing by the rules for those special privileges. So, MP's basic salary is currently £81,932 a year, and is more if they serve as government ministers. Minister salaries have also been frozen for a year. ISPA's formula for MP's pay is linked to any increase in average pay for public sector workers. A little bit misleading, and as in, because it's public sector, of course, so it's dictated by fiat instead of just by market value. So it isn't really an accurate depiction of how much it's worth. But surely, seeing as there are 650 MPs for 650 different constituencies, that it would make more sense for it to be tied by, essentially, the amount of tax revenue brought in from those particular constituencies. Or, if you will, then the total amount of money generated. But I say it's easier to do it through taxes because, of course, that is how they're going to get the money in order to pay them in the first place. And if done through that, then there would be a definite interest, self-interest, in saying, okay, well then how much revenue can we raise? What is the maximum? Because then I'm going to be paid the most, which won't be with the highest tax rates, but instead will be with the highest level of productivity. You could try and do it with the GDP instead, but then of course you're not going to be raising as much tax, because the highest level of GDP will be with zero tax. And that will also mean that because that MP is looking out for their own best interests, they're not going to be promising things to their constituents that was going to put them in the shit. Instead, they're going to be maximising their own profits. It's going to run on those selfish incentives, which is going to therefore be better for everybody, because they want the greatest amount of money coming to themselves, which is going to have to hit the laughter curve in that sweet spot, so that people will actually make the money and they won't begrudge paying the tax too much, because if the tax rates are too high, they're not going to be working as hard, they're not going to be generating as much money, and the more affluent or successful people will move elsewhere. And if it is too low, not that it really can be, but, you know, obviously you're going to get more tax revenue at 1% than 0%. Quite clearly. So I say that's probably a better way to do it, and therefore you don't have to do it down to public sector. You simply do it down to your own particular constituencies. But, of course, that would then mean saying that the individual mayors have more power over their constituency, and the individual MPs have more power over their constituencies than doing things on a national level, which I know Westminster will find as heresy and absolutely abhor. But that's how it stands. So as always, let me know what you guys think down below in terms of shortening the COVID quarantine times and the possible reasons for that, if it isn't just to get people to work so that the MPs can be paid more because it's their selfish interests, or if it's always the science instead. And we think about the idea of changing how they're paid, instead of it just being linked to the public sector, but instead on how much tax revenue is being raised through their own particular constituency. Always intrigued to hear what you guys have to say, and as always, until next time, have a good one.